If I rule the world, I love 'em, baby.
All right, If I Rule the World podcast welcomes Noah Levine. What's going on, Noah?
What's happening? Hey, good, man. Nice to see you, George.
Is it Levine or Levine?
Who cares?
I care. I care a lot. I'm a grammar Nazi, and this matters to me.
Okay, so it is Levine. That is how my family pronounces it. I think that 99% of people pronounce it Levine. So who cares?
You know what? I think by the end of this podcast, I'll be calling you Levine because I'll be closer to you. How about that?
Cool. Good enough.
You know how like people that know Walter from Gorilla Biscuits call him Wally?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm hoping by the end of this, I could be like Wally with you.
It is cool.
What's up, Wally? I'm going to try that with him next time I see him, and he's going to be like, look, we're not good like that.
So I just wanted to bring up a brief history of where I first met you. And I don't know in the time that I've been talking to you on Instagram if you remember. So I'll explain it, and you can just pretend you do. But back, I think it was 2004 or 2005. I don't remember the year exactly, but it was at the Omega Institute, upstate New York.
Yep.
And it was before Dharma Punks or Meditate and Destroy or anything like that. And I had read in Tricycle Magazine an article about you. And for those who don't know, Tricycle Magazine is like the Rolling Stones of the Buddhist magazines, I guess. And it said, the punk monk or whatever it was. And so when I was there, I saw you, covered in tattoos. I'm like, oh, that's that guy. We started to talk, and you were just there writing, I think, and you did do like a little meditation thing, but you weren't teaching a workshop or anything. That's how we met. Talked to you a little bit. Years later, I saw you in New York, and you were teaching in New York, and in the audience at that teaching was like Mark from In Your Face and one of the guys from Token Entry and different hardcore kids from our part of the world. And that's just the background of how I remember you. So now you can pretend you remember me.
That's right. I don't, to be honest, George, I remember being at Omega then. I think I must have been, like, Dharma Punks came out in 2003. So, and I think you're right, it was maybe 04 or 05 when I was up there, because I was doing like a residential, writing retreat up there and teaching a little bit.
The documentary wasn't out. That's what it was.
No, the doc wasn't out. And then I wasn't, because I moved to New York, I think in 04.
Okay.
And I think that's when we ran into each other and down at the New York Open Center.
Right. That's it. All right. So what I wanted to ask you is basically we'll get into everything you do, what you're doing and present day and the past, but I'd like to get down your history a little bit and where you started out in punk rock and music back then in California and where you first learned about this music.
Yeah, I started listening to punk when I was about 10 years old. I had an older sister. She had older, like, skate surf punk boyfriends. And, I ended up with a tape that had both, early English punk like Sex Pistols and The Clash, and also like, Black Flag on it. And when I heard punk rock, it was just, I was home, and it felt like the voice of God, and just, kind of gave me an outlet for all of the angst that I was already experiencing. And when I went to my first punk rock show, like one of the first times I went and saw live music, there was an all ages show. I was about 13 or 14 years old. And it was like Blast, Faction, I think JFA was playing. Mm-hmm. And there was a guy at the door who was like running the place, and he said, "Hey kid, you want to put up flyers for the shows and get in for free?" And so, like, right away I had this hookup where I, after every show he would give me a pile of flyers, and then I'd go around town and put them on the telephone poles, and I was on the guest list for every punk show from then on. And so I had about a year of just getting to see every band that came through. And this is 1984 in Santa Cruz, and all of the touring bands were coming through. Yeah, it was just like such a blessing.
Did you get a chance to see Suicidal Tendencies by any chance?
I saw Suicidal Tendencies in 1984. Maybe it was 85 in Palo Alto. And so it was actually the first time. I'm glad that you asked me that. The first show that I left Santa Cruz, and like, a bunch of guys downtown were like, we're going over the hill, like to the city, to San Jose, to go see Suicidal. And I was just like, I'm in. And we went and saw Suicidal, and it was so awesome and scary. Just like the first time I was in like a gang fight, where it was like, instead of just a circle pit, it was just, a bunch of guys in bandanas punching people that were trying to slam dance. And it was, for me, I was like trying to do stage dives, and the Suicidal guys were like trying to beat us up while we were trying to do stage dives, and it was so dangerous. It was so fun.
Yeah, that's one of those bands. My name is Sam, by the way. I don't even think I jumped in.
Hey, Sam.
So yeah, that's one of the bands that like legendary people talk about, like how those shows were. So just to hear from your mouth or someone that was there, I couldn't resist asking about Suicidal. So thank you.
No, it was great, because it was the first show that I saw outside of my home club, and it just, it was a game changer for me.
Was that the most violent band that you were around? I just say it in that way because now my brain is going to like the shows in New York, Cro-Mags, Bad Brain shows. Like, I was just trying to think of like what would be comparative to Suicidal in LA or California.
So LA had such a different scene than Santa Cruz. In Santa Cruz, our issue was it wasn't that bad at the punk shows. There was the skate punks, there was the surf punks, then there was the street punks, then there was some mods, some skinheads. So of course there was always the factions within the different, subculture. But what also happened that made a lot of violence at our shows was this club was called Club Culture. Mm-hmm. And it was an all ages club that like every other night had breakdancing contests, and then every other night had punk rock shows. So there became this like real turf battle, and especially like the graffiti, because there would be like this hip hop graffiti on the back of the building, right. And then the punks would go and cross it out and put punk rock graffiti across it. And so then the breakdancers and the hip hop b-boy kids started jumping the punks, and then the punks started jumping and so it was more not like in like punks against punks as much as this like culture war that started at our club.
Wow. I mean, just for the record, my money would be on the hip hop kids.
Yeah.
That would be the
in New York, that would be a good bet. But in Santa Cruz, not a good bet.
Really?
Because because they were definitely the minority. Like punk rock is such like a white scene, and Santa Cruz is a super white town. There's no diversity, so the hip hop kids were just a small group of breakdancers. They weren't. It wasn't like New York. You got
to go with the numbers, George.
You got to go.
Right. And if my limited knowledge of breakdancing on the West Coast would be Breakin' and Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo, and they wouldn't win the fight.
That's right.
So,
well, I think also an important part of my story about that, like, not only was that my experience of getting into, seeing bands, but also I found a mixtape at the club when I was like putting flyers out, and it was like Houdini, Curtis Blow,
right,
Roxanne, the real Roxanne. So then I like listened to the hip hop shit that the breakdancers. I was like, this shit is punk rock too.
Right.
I love hip hop, but back then it was like you had to choose.
You did.
You weren't into hip hop and punk rock in 1984. You had to choose, and so there's like hip hop was like our guilty pleasure secret.
But even for me, like I was thinking about that. I was listening to actually the Dean Del Rey podcast today, and he mentioned it too. He's like, when you're younger, maybe it's just like a generational thing. Like you have to pick. Like when you're like 10, 11, 12, 13, it's like either or. I'm like, well, I can't listen to this because I listen to this.
Right.
And then as you get older, you're like, wait, I can listen to everything. So I completely relate with that.
That's how it was in school. There was just different, like someone walked in and they looked a certain way. You're like, I don't know them now, but we're going to be friends by the end of the year because they just, look close enough.
Yeah. It was either you like New Kids on the Block or Skid Row. That's what I remember from my school.
Even seeing Noah.
That's sad but funny.
Even seeing Noah at Omega, he's covered in tattoos. It's like I know what like you just get you just get sort of like even pushed together.
Yeah.
Those are my people.
Yeah,
Go talk to that guy.
You just start like moving together. But I'm curious, did you ever actually play in a band?
Never did. I never. I think by the time, because I mean, you know my story. I got strung out. I got locked up. So I was too busy smoking crack to try to practice an instrument.
Right.
And then once I got clean, and I got clean young. I got sober in 1988.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But then I was just so focused on like getting out of juvenile hall and getting my shit together. I bought a bass. And I was like, well, maybe, bass seems like easy to play. I should play that. But what really happened for me was that I got too focused on like my recovery and meditation practice. And although punk and, the music scene was so central, it didn't feel like it was the right use of my energy. I wasn't going to play music. I was going to like try to get enlightened.
For me, like, so I got strung out at like from like 13 to 20. Right?
Yeah.
I started doing, fucking around with drugs at 13. And by like 15, I was like, shooting heroin. So by like 20, I got sober, which was 1998. And then from like my mid-20s is when I first started really playing music. So I'm a late bloomer. But it's the same thing. Like I like music and I was so involved with it, but like I like drugs and girls a lot more at that.
And it was very close. Like the guys in Good Riddance were, some of my closest friends. Fury 66, Blast, like those Santa Cruz bands. Those were my, closest friends. And so it's very central to me, but I just never really put the energy into learning an instrument.
And you touched on it a little bit, like your recovery. And I know that there was a change for you, although your dad was a meditation teacher, a well-known meditation teacher. It's not something that connected with you, but in jail is where you found meditation. Am I correct?
Yeah, I was sitting in juvenile hall looking at my third felony, strung out, shooting heroin, smoking crack, completely an addict, and, looking at a 7-year suspended sentence and a new felony arrest. And I was just fucked. And I asked my dad for some help. And he said, well, let me teach you some meditation instructions. And I was like, fuck you, Dad. Like, I need a lawyer. I don't want your hippie meditation bullshit. But I was desperate enough to be like, okay, if that's the help you're willing to offer me, I'll try anything because I am suffering. And, I went back to my cell and started paying attention to my breath. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't have to obey my mind. Mm-hmm. My mind was saying, think about the future, think about the past, regret, shame, guilt, anger, fear, all of those emotions coming up. And then I realized, I can just bring my attention to the sensations of my breath. And I can let that shit be in the background. I can ignore it for a minute. I can disobey it. And that was just a game changer for me. I couldn't do it that well. It wasn't like all of a sudden I had some spiritual experience, but I got it right from the beginning that this was a powerful practice. This was a tool to allow me to disobey my confused mind.
Now, can you do me a favor? You're a meditation teacher, and I'm sure a lot of people always, have these different ideas about meditation. It's something I've been on again, off again for many years. But just as an asterisk right now, and you loosely did it, but can you define what meditation is for people listening to this right now?
Yes, but it's not going to be short because meditation is a million different things to a million different people. It's kind of like saying what's punk or what's hip hop. Mm-hmm. Like it's a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So meditation can be broken down into several different categories. There's mindfulness meditation, which is turning towards reality as it is with non-judgmental present time awareness.
Okay.
There's concentration meditations, which are focusing on a single object and ignoring everything else. So you're not completely turning towards reality. You're tuning some of reality out by concentrating on one thing.
Okay.
There's heart practice, like emotional intelligence meditations, like forgiveness meditation, compassion meditation, that are developing a positive emotional experience, of kindness or compassion. So meditation can be a lot of, then there's contemplative meditations, contemplating, and there's reflective meditations, and there's, guided meditations and guided imagery, visualizations, right? Like, so there's a lot of different meditations. When I was sitting in juvenile hall, the initial thing for me was mindfulness of the breath.
Mm-hmm.
Ignore your mind, pay attention to your breath.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not stop your mind, right? That's the biggest misconception I think people hold about meditation. They think, oh, you have to stop your thoughts.
Right.
And I can't do that, so I can't meditate.
Right.
And the instruction really is stop paying attention to your thoughts and start paying attention to your body.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first foundation of mindfulness. Now, later, you'll get stabilized enough in meditation to actually turn towards and pay attention to your thoughts with that, what I said before, non-judgmental awareness, where you're just watching your thoughts pass by like you would be watching clouds or bubbles or something like that. Not so identified with our thinking mind, but more of an observer consciousness.
Yeah, I think that's, you said it. It's like the biggest misconception. Like when I remember when I first went to like a yoga class, and teacher would say, okay, now sit down, clear your mind. And I'd be like, I can't. And that it wasn't meditation, as in the way that you're talking about it, because you can't stop your thoughts. And I think you probably have always heard when people talk about meditation is, I can't do it because when I sit down, my mind goes crazy. And it's, your mind's always going crazy. You're just noticing it. So it's
absolutely. I believe everybody can, and meditation's hard. It's not easy. It's not like some people are just like naturally calm and quiet. We all have a human mind, and and the mind is a busy thing. It's a thinking, planning, meaning-making machine.
right.
And meditation is about changing our relationship to it and training it. One of the things the Buddha said was the untrained mind is like a wild monkey,
Mm-hmm.
swinging to the future and to the past, and and that meditation tames it so that it hangs out more in the present.
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful way to put it. And now and when you hear it like that, it makes sense on an intellectual level. But you're in jail. You got a lot going on there with withdrawal, with all these different things. Even though you come from like your father, like a lineage that it's in your orbit to some degree.
Yeah.
Maybe that feels like the worst place to do it, and maybe it would be the best place. Like, who knows? But how did that like change, your movement towards Dharma Punks like at that moment?
I mean, I think that, I already said it, but I realized that there was a powerful tool here, and that it wasn't hippie bullshit, but that actually there was a psychological tool here that gave me a little bit of relief from the misery that my mind was creating.
Mm-hmm.
It was just it wasn't like all of a sudden I felt good. Like you said, I was detoxing, I was locked up, I was terrified about going to prison for the rest of my, but tuning out from those terrified thoughts and just feeling my detoxing body laying on that hard jail cell mattress, it was better to be present in my body than what my mind was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kept coming back to my breath and ignoring my mind, and I got it. I was like, oh, this is hard.
Mm-hmm.
I'm rebelling against my mind's tendency, which eventually led me to understanding that meditation is a form of rebellion, which fit perfectly with what I was, already completely committed to, which was rebelling against the norm.
Right.
Do you think for anyone doing like 10 to 20 years or something, I mean, this sounds like something pretty beneficial. Like, I don't know how many people in prison meditate, but I would imagine it seems to be like maybe something that would help.
Absolutely. And there's more and more programs going into prisons, and you meet people in prison that, it also depends on where you're locked up, whether there's anybody that like brings it in. But there's been great, books written about, using incarcerated time as a spiritual practice. I had a teacher named Bo Lozoff that wrote this book, We're All Doing Time. And it was just like a free prison distribution book where he would just get into as many prisons as he could and say, like, okay, here's the human condition. And we're all doing time as humans. And some of us are actually locked up. But freedom is a state of mind, not a physical reality. And that you can you can experience some, emotional, mental, spiritual freedom even when you're doing time. And so a lot of people inside do get a meditation practice going.
You had studied with Prison Dharma Network, Fleet Mall?
Yeah, I mean, Fleet, I hadn't really studied with him. Bo Lozoff, the Human Kindness Foundation, had been more, inspirational to me. Fleet, I did some stuff with later after, when he got out of prison and started the Prison Dharma Network. But I was already doing the Mind Body Awareness Project, the Juvenile Hall meditation group stuff by the time I connected with Fleet.
Yeah, I did that. I think when it changed to Prison Mindfulness Institute, I had done an online course with him, which was just...
He's great. They do a really good work.
It was phenomenal because it was just like more of like my nerdy self just being like, how would you teach this? And answering my own questions, not to necessarily become a teacher, but just to learn it in that way. And the course was phenomenal. What the work they do is phenomenal, and it's difficult work to get people to. I thought like naively, like, oh, you'd walk in, you'd show these people things, and they would get it, and it's a lot more difficult than that. It was like a naive approach I had towards what I learned. So let's first also condolences on your dad. I know he passed away 2 years ago. Was it?
Yeah, coming up on 3 years.
Someone had given me one of his books this year. I had a passing in my family, and right around the time I started talking to you, coincidentally, someone had given me Unintended Sorrow to listen to read.
I think that's his best book.
It's a great
Did you
book.
love it?
Well, I started reading it, but like a lot of books, I haven't finished it yet.
Right. I mean, he must have written 12 or 15. I mean, he's got so many books. And there's so many good ones. Who Dies is such an amazing book. Gradual Awakening is such a great meditation book. A Year to Live is like crazy good and really transformational for people. But Unattended Sorrow was like the culmination of like 30 years of his life's work of like, how do we really attend to this suffering and the sorrow that we hold as human beings, and how do we meet it with compassion and mercy and forgiveness? I just love that book.
It's on the list. Noah, of things to finish.
Yeah.
So let's get to Dharma Punks, because that then becomes like, you almost, and the way I see it is like you thought of it like a band, the way we think of things like a branding and, how do I put this together? And
I was like, okay, I'm going on tour. I better make T-shirts and stickers.
Yeah. Didn't you go on Warped Tour or something like that?
I did. I went on a Warped Tour. But also, like, even before the book came out, I was already like embroidering Dharma Punks on my jacket just because I've got a gang mentality, right? And so it's like, this is my new clique. And, we're a bunch of punk rockers that are practicing Buddhism, and, we got to get some gear. We got to get our colors together.
That's the suicidal tendencies.
Yeah, totally.
Got to get bandanas like Mike Muir.
Yeah, we do. We need those. So, Dharma Punks, so I'm in 1988, I'm sitting in juvie. I start meditating. I get sober. I do AA, 12 steps. In the 12 steps, I'm like, okay, these are my people, but this Christian philosophy doesn't really resonate with me. Buddhism makes a lot of sense, but so I'm like practicing Buddhism, and I'm finding community in the fellowship of, the 12-step rooms. And after some years, people come around and they're like, hey, we want to learn about meditation. And so I start teaching meditation. I did that Year to Live practice of my father in like the mid 90s, went to India, did this crazy year of travel. And when I came back, I was just like, what am I going to do with my life? Like, all I want to do is get enlightened. All I want to do is end suffering.
Simple.
And so I went back to school. Yeah. So I went back to school, And in school, I did this like completion program, and I had to write 5 25-page papers about my life. And in writing those pages about my life, my teacher was like, "You've lived a crazy fucking life," because I wrote a paper about like in the punk scene. I wrote a paper about Buddhism. I wrote a paper about traveling in India. So all of these things, working in prison, like, I started these juvenile hall prison projects, and so my teacher looked at it and they were like, "You have to write a book. Like you need to fucking share this with people." And since my father was a writer and everything, I was like, okay, I'll try. And so like those papers actually turned into Dharma Punks. I mean, I had to rewrite the whole thing.
Right.
But when Dharma Punks came out, like I said, even before it came out, it just became like something to identify with. And of course, inspired by Kerouac and Dharma Bums.
Yeah.
And I got so inspired by that beat literature, which is like, these are American, guys who are still cool, right? They're not,
right.
they're
renounce
like
the
traveling,
world.
they're
Yeah.
hitchhiking, they're getting loaded, they're getting laid,
orgies.
So yeah, but not, but our generation, not beatniks, not hippies, punks as the next generation of counterculture. And so of course I stole the name from Dharma Bums and made Dharma Punks, and then I think you're right, like my model was kind of bands instead of like I didn't know, like, okay, I wrote a book, so well, let's make t-shirts.
Right.
Let's make sweatshirts.
Right.
We've got these meditation groups, people are coming, like, hey, let's all like gear up. And then I went on the Warped Tour. The year that it came out, I had friends on the Warped Tour, and they're like, yeah, come out. Kevin Lyman, who ran it, was a friend of a friend, and he was like, yeah, man, come out, teach meditation groups on the Warped Tour, promote your book. It was very, very fun.
Wow. Now, and I think growing up in the music that we did back then in the 80s, even if like Bad Brains was spiritual, quote unquote, there were certain things around. Then even a little bit later with Krishna, people knew shelter and there was some acceptance of it, but I don't remember anything about people meditating. And I don't,
right.
So you're sort of like walking this into the Warped Tour. I think so now. I don't think anyone would blink, and mindfulness is like a popular word, but back then, like, how did that like work with people? Were they like able to sit down? Were they able to hear you?
Surprisingly responsive. And I think also what helps a lot is all of the recovery stuff, because all of the guys in the bands that are in AA, that are recovery guys, the 11th step says, meditate, sought through prayer and meditation. Mm-hmm. So, I got a lot of the recovery people would come check it out. And then, even back then in 2003, people were just more open-minded. And of course, more open-minded about hearing it from somebody that looks like me, mm-hmm. because I look like them,
right.
And so a lot of people came to check it out. And, like in 2004, when I was in New York, like you said, like all these guys from the New York hardcore scene started coming.
Right.
And, in LA, I've got all these guys from the, old punk bands that come. And I think it's partially because we all got into punk rock because we were seeking something different, mm-hmm. And we're seeking some freedom, and we had dissatisfaction with the status quo. And it's just what Buddhism teaches. It's like, if you're dissatisfied with the status quo, there's something you can do about it.
Right.
And here's a path.
And I think it is another misunderstanding about the filter of Buddhism and spirituality, is that it just feels like there's a, more of a conformity to it. But there's more, technically, if you read about it and study it, it's a question everything mentality.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it became a religion, and religion fucks everything up. But originally it was a kind of anti-religion. Right. It was don't believe all of this shit. Check out your own mind and find the truth for yourself.
Right.
But then they turned that into a religion, and then you're supposed to bow to statues.
Right. Hey, you got some statues for sale on dharmapunks.com, right? Noah Levine.
Yeah, the Mohawk statues.
It's pretty fly.
Just don't bow to them or they explode.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah, so you never looked back after you got sober, right? You never had like a relapse or anything.
I've never had a relapse. I mean, of course I've looked.
Yeah.
But I've never. No, I
So-
just celebrated 30 years clean.
Holy shit. Yeah, I just got 20. So I'm 10
Congratulations.
10 behind you.
Yeah, you got the double X, but I got the triple X.
I
You
know,
get one
yeah.
more decade.
At this point, it's weird because it just doesn't even like it was such a back then it was like 7 years of my life mixed in with like rehabs and detoxes and jail. But now like 20 years later, even new people that I meet, they're like, I just can't picture it, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know. It's just I was super self-destructive, but also naive mixed in together, and I was just down to do whatever the fuck,
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, man.
And I don't unlike George, I don't know much about meditation. I'm just kind of hanging, so I'm absorbing everything that you're saying.
Well, yeah, and I'm sure we'll get the conversation around to Refuge Recovery too, which like when you and I got sober, we didn't have any choice except for 12-step.
Yeah.
Now Refuge Recovery has been around for 4, almost 5 years, and there's people getting clean that are like, oh, I can actually choose if I want to do a Buddhist recovery approach or a 12-step approach.
Oh, really? Yeah, I had no
Yeah.
idea. For me,
And so there's now thousands of people that are getting clean just using Buddhism.
yeah, me I basically I'm a limit pusher, so I took it to the very end to where they were like, yo, you want to do a 1 to 3 upstate, or do you want to go to like this therapeutic community?
Right.
So I just kept fucking around. I remember, just going to jail, getting out, and at that point, they were, I'm thinking like, wow, do I really want to do 3 years upstate, or do I want to actually try to get clean?
As if it's a choice.
Yeah, I mean, it was a shitty
Hey,
choice.
3 years might not be that bad as long as I don't gotta get clean.
Yeah. Because I'm thinking, and I was like, all right, fuck it. I pushed it as far as I can go. And there's one thing that I will say. I remember I went to this place called Apple, and at that moment in time, something happened in my head after like many attempts where the president of that place, I remember, had a meeting with all the people. Maybe it was like 50 of us that lived in this house. And the statistics speech that they give you, which is always bizarre. I don't know why they do it. So
10% of you are going to survive.
Yes. Yeah. So he goes and he looks at like 50 of us, and he's like, 2 of you guys are going to stay clean and the rest aren't. And I was like, in my head, something happened where I looked at him and I said to myself, I didn't say it to anyone, I'm like, I'm one of those 2 fucking people. I don't give a shit. I'm one. And I that's exactly what happened. So.
That's fucking great. Yeah, that's a weird speech to give because, I think then a lot of people are just like, well, fuck it.
Yeah. Honestly. Yeah, absolutely.
There's not really that much hope. Fuck it.
No. Yeah, but to me, I don't know. I guess at a certain point, everyone just has their different bottom, and I was just like, I'm one of those 2. You guys could fight over this last one, but this one's for me.
That's great. That's great.
So what you were talking about, Refuge Recovery, is, well, I know you did a few books since Dharma Punks. It's Against the Stream, The Heart of the Revolution, and then Refuge Recovery. And things sprung out of that. There's retreat centers, there's Refuge Recovery, and there's different things that sprung out of that. I'm not totally sure exactly what you were involved with, and there's other people that just took it on themselves, like Dharma Punks in different states. So
right.
What did you start to do after that? As you started writing books, as like the next step after books?
Yeah, I mean, I went to graduate school and I became a therapist. I got a master's in psychology, and I figured like, okay, if I'm going to be a Buddhist teacher, I should be grounded in Western psychology as well. Mm-hmm. And so I got a master's just right when Dharma Punks came out. Started a counseling practice, started teaching classes, started teaching retreats. I went through this 5-year Buddhist teacher training process with Jack Kornfield, my teacher. And then, just like, okay, well, do the next book. And, Dharma Punks was just my story. And then I was like, okay, I want to do a teaching book about how, the whole Buddhist path is going against greed, against hatred, against delusion, that this is a path for spiritual revolutionaries. And, so Against the Stream came out. I was living in New York. I moved to LA. Dharma Punks got picked up to be a movie. And so I moved to LA to like work on the production and screenplay and all that stuff. I knew, of course, that it was unlikely that it would ever get made, but I was like, might as well try. Might as well go out there and put some effort into it, because this book has helped. I got great feedback from the book. So many people are saying like, this helps me. I relate to it. It's inspiring me. It's helping me get sober, whatever.
Yeah.
I was like, so if we could do a movie, that would be amazing. Like that would help people get turned on to meditation practice.
Yeah.
Like a documentary.
It never happened, but I did the next book. I did Against the Stream, and then we opened
the movie
meditation center out here.
You weren't talking about Meditate and Destroy. You're talking about something else.
No, I was talking about actually a feature film for Dharma Punks, of actually adapting, the biopic and kind of trying to recreate the 80s punk scene and the spiritual journey.
Oh.
Which would have been really cool if it had ever happened, but it never happened. And Meditate and Destroy was, I don't want to say it was a mistake, but it was just one of those things where, some woman came up to me and was like, "Hey, I'd like to film you doing some talks," and all of a sudden it turned into like her and the film crew following me around for 2 years. Wow. To everything that I did to make a full length, documentary.
2 years.
2 years.
Yeah, it was a process.
Wow, that's crazy. 2 years.
Do you not have like a warm view of that documentary?
I have mixed feelings about it. I don't feel like it. I don't feel like it completely worked for the intention behind it. But I think some people have enjoyed it, and it's turned some people on to practice, and that's good enough for me. Yeah,
it's a door. It's like a record you put out when you're like, all right, and then you look back and you're like, song number 2 could have used a little work.
It's a demo. Well, let's just say that.
It's the Revelation 7-inch.
Yeah, everyone loves a demo.
It's not the full length. Yeah. So, and then some of the retreat centers that you started or that you're involved with. When did that all start?
So the meditation center. So in LA, in 2000, I came out here in 2005, and then maybe in 2007 or 2008. One person and one of my students was like, "Hey, we should open a meditation center. I'll give you $40,000." And I was like, let's start a nonprofit and have our own place. Because up until then, in New York, I was at a yoga place. I was just renting other places. And I was like, all right, let's try to do this. The community is big. There's over 100 people at all the classes. It's getting bigger and bigger. And so I signed a lease on this place that was cost $20,000 first last deposit. So I had 2 months rent and I signed a 5-year lease on this meditation center. And I was just like, well, sink or swim. Let's see, if the community steps up and supports this thing, then it'll go. And if not, so be it. And it was great, we went from, the first year, completely making rent, to the second year to putting on retreats, to having this thriving nonprofit, which ended up with 2 meditation centers, one in Hollywood, one in Santa Monica. And then we opened one in San Francisco a few years later, affiliated ones in Nashville and in Boston, and Seattle. It just became this really thriving community, based on Against the Stream.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like it went Dharma Punks, then Against the Stream. As far as affiliated, in the way that you put it. And now it's more Refuge Recovery is where you're at, is what you do?
Yeah, for my, so then Heart of the Revolution came out, which was okay, let's really look at the revolutionary practice of kindness, of compassion, of forgiving ourselves and others and asking for forgiveness. And then so many people in my community were saying look, I'm using this for my recovery. I made Against the Stream open to everyone. I didn't want it to be just a recovery thing. I didn't want to be the recovery Buddhist guy. I wanted to say hey, this is for everyone who's suffering. Some of you are suffering from addiction. Some of you aren't, but you're still interested in ending your suffering.
Right.
But so many people in my community were saying, like, we need a Buddhist recovery movement. And so, I have enough arrogance and ambition to say, like, okay, let's do that next. That's the next right thing to do. Let's create a Buddhist recovery movement. And so I sat down and I wrote Refuge Recovery, and I created it to say, like, hey, this needs to be like the 12 steps, where it's peer led, so that it's reproducible all over the country, so that there can be a meeting format, there can be an organization where people can use this non-theistic spiritual practice to address their addiction. Because I love the 12 steps, but the whole kind of you have to believe in God thing never resonated with me. Right. That's why I liked Buddhism so much, because they're not asking me to believe in God.
Yeah, it never resonated with me either.
Right.
When I was going to those meetings, and I didn't even stay going to the meetings. I pretty much left quick, but that was like an issue for an atheist like me,
Yes, and that's why, like, Buddhism is atheism, right? Like, you don't have to believe. And it's open, like, if you do believe, cool, but if you don't, that's cool.
Yeah.
And so, Refuge, we had, like, in 2000, how long has it been out? It's been out for 4 years, so 2012. Is that right? No, 14.
14 was Refuge
I think
Recovery.
it came out in 14.
According to your
and 14 Wikipedia. Came out in 14. We had like about maybe 10 Refuge Recovery meetings around, there was like in LA where I am, I think San Francisco, they had started one in Oklahoma, so some of my crew had started some meetings, and then the book came out. Right. And the book came out in the first year, there was like over 100 refuge meetings. In the second year, there was like 300. Wow. And now there's like almost 700 refuge recovery meetings around the country and internationally, Europe. And so it's, it's becoming an addition or an alternative to 12 steps, where people are using this 4 noble truths, 8-fold path, mindfulness-based approach to treating addiction.
That is incredible.
Yes, really incredible. It's growing and it's thriving.
Yeah, there's something about, like we talked about in the very beginning, like branding, like bands and patches and colors and all of this stuff. And as someone who was in that world, and then you're also, like, as you're studying Buddhism, how do you square, like, when it all clashes together? Like you said, you're arrogant enough to do Refuge Recovery, and there's an awareness of what you're saying, So, like, how do you square that? Like, hey, I want another tattoo. I want this. I want that. And then, this other world of, the filter of, non-reaction and attachment and all of that. How do you square all of that stuff?
I just feel like we're in this material world, and we're in a capitalist society, and we're in, whatever, a democratic society, whatever. So I just feel like we apply the wisdom and the teachings to rather than rejecting our culture completely, even though, like, some of it, we reject, but some of it's just like, no, this is the form that we're functioning in. Mm-hmm. We're functioning in a form where you do branding for your meditation center. Yeah. We're functioning in, on a realm where, you do some promotion, whatever, you do a social media page. There's just like an acceptance of, like, we don't have to be so radical that we reject all of the conventional tools for this, which is like the intention, which is, let's spread goodness, let's spread kindness, let's spread generosity, let's spread wisdom. And so, and I think I said earlier, I also just I like branding, I like labels, I like gang mentality. I always want to click up with, like, I always want to be part of the coolest clique. And I have definitely an aesthetic of what it should look like.
And you know what it is. Yes. I think a lot of, even what I can appreciate about what you do and the way you teach it is that, as much as I enjoyed reading about Tibetan Buddhism, it's just like stories. It was just like cool stories, but it didn't relate to me. I didn't grow up in Nepal. I'm not a monk, and I don't want to be. You know,
Right.
but the teachings, the science of mind is what I was interested in. And when I can see it through the lens of where I grew up in Western culture and all of the trappings, and, you know, we catch ourselves, you know, through some of the teachings, but we're still a human being. We still curse and have feelings and, you know, fuck up all the time. It was a lot more approachable. And then from your perspective of the branding, to just get it out there makes a lot of sense. You know, even more so than the Jack Cornfields and the Stephen Levines. There's someone could say Refuge Recovery, and there's a brand behind it, but it makes sense. There's something to sink your teeth.
Yeah,
into.
and I think again, it's from growing up in the punk scene where it's like, oh yeah, no, you make a T-shirt, make some stickers. You know, you got a band, make a T-shirt. You got, you know, make some bumper stickers. And I just always did, you know, so I've always done that for everything that I do.
Right. Clearly it works, Noah.
Yeah.
So yeah, speaking of, you know, imperfect qualities, you and I discussed a little bit some of the Dharma drama that had happened in the past few years with you. I saw the video you put out. I read Rachel Savage's article. I feel like, you know, some of more of the truth and your perspective is getting out there than maybe it was months ago. Can you talk a little bit about what you went through and where you're at with that right now?
Well, in brief, you know, I got Me Too'd when the Me Too movement started last year. A woman that I was dating kind of, you know, said, you know, I feel like some of our experience was non-consensual, and she, you know, that got her she wasn't one of my students, but she was a Buddhist person. Her teacher sent this letter around to all of my communities saying my student said Noah raped her, and I was like, what
Whoa.
the fuck are you talking about? Like, this was completely consensual. You know, we were dating. She never said anything to me about being unhappy. But it happened, and my organization Against the Stream said, okay, well, we have to suspend you. We're going to do an investigation. The investigation dragged on for 5 months.
Wow.
And just having that kind of, you know, with the Me Too energy out there and all of the kind of social media, and there was, websites were writing about it. The Buddhist magazines were writing about me being suspended. It ended up just destroying all of my meditation centers. They all closed. Mm-hmm. My treatment center, Refuge Recovery Treatment Center, closed. The Refuge Recovery Board of Directors wants me to go away forever from the, you know, recovery movement that I started. Mm-hmm. And I'm over here going like, hey, this isn't actually true.
Right.
You know, like I've been accused, you know, 2 other women stepped up and said, yeah, I went out with him and he kissed me too hard. He was very aggressive when we were becoming sexual. And I'm kind of going like, wait a minute, you had a bad date with me? So, you know, from my perspective, I must have been unskillful on some level or another. And I'm willing to take full responsibility for anything that I actually did. Mm-hmm. But I didn't force anybody to do anything ever.
Right.
You know, like it was, and at the very most, it's like there wasn't good enough communication. But it doesn't seem to matter. I wasn't charged with anything, you know, like, but it doesn't seem to matter in the cultural movement where it just, you know, it destroyed almost all of the organizations that I had created.
Right.
And so I'm, you know, I'm still teaching every week. I'm still teaching retreats. I'm still, you know, acting as a counselor and therapist to people. But it's just put a huge, you know, it's just been so harmful to my community and so confusing and disillusioning to people. You know, the people that really know me are like, yeah, there's no way that this is true. But, you know, most of the people in Refuge Recovery or in the Buddhist, you know, Sanghas around the world, they don't know me.
Right.
And, you know, there's that strong thing, which I agree with, which is like, just believe women. Women have not been believed for too long. Right. Especially with like the Kavanaugh and Ford stuff that was just going on and Trump in office. Like, I get it. I'm a fan of Me Too.
Right.
You know, I think that it's mostly positive, that it's a very important shift that needs to happen in our culture. I would consider myself a feminist. I believe in equality,
Yeah.
100%. But I'm on the other side of this, where then I've also been accused of really bad behavior, most of which I don't feel like is actually true at all.
Right.
But, you know, people don't want to believe the guy. And I get it. I don't want to believe the guy either, except for I'm the guy. I'm the guy. And I'm like, wait a minute, I was there. This was consensual.
That's, you know, it's a difficult conversation to have because it's nuanced.
Absolutely.
It's very nuanced. And dating is fucking messy. You know, it's just there's a moment you lean in for the kiss and you don't know what the other person is thinking. I've been around situations where I've seen, you know, the women I know have been sexually assaulted, but men I know have been falsely accused.
Yeah.
Men I know have been sexually assaulted. And I've known women who've called the cops just to get back at their boyfriend. And just saying that right there would put me in a position that, like, you know, that I'm, you know, against the Me Too movement or whatever. And that's not true. I mean, but it's just like anything. It's hard to put a hashtag next to something and say, here are the rules.
Well, sure, because once you put like a human filter on it, like it's just so tainted sometimes, you know. And now, you know, the situation that happened with you and the person that you were, I guess, you said you were dating this person. Now, you know, fucking Joe Schmo from Michigan, you know, doesn't accept your apology, doesn't know anything about anything, and starts like sharing and doing all this stuff, and it's like, well, who, like, it's between them, and that's like the one part I don't like is just that a swipe of your phone where you could just share these things that might not even be true.
You know, I mean, I'm doing my best to not take it all too personally. Like I said, I think that this is a really important movement that's happening, and that, you know, the vast majority of the accusations are true, and, you know, people who've been abusing their power. And in the Buddhist world, it's happened a lot. We just saw it in Sogyal Rinpoche's community, hundreds of women who he had been, you know, sexually inappropriate with. We just saw it in Shambhala. You know, in my community, I didn't have any students that came forward. You know, these were women from my private life. So it wasn't like I'm another, you know, scumbag spiritual teacher that's misusing their power to seduce their students. For me, this was just like women that I was dating. I got divorced a few years ago. I was just dating. And, you know, a couple women said, hey, I didn't like it. And for me, I'm like, hey, if you didn't like it, I'll fully make amends to you if I was inappropriate in any way. But, you know, this was not a Me Too. This wasn't an abuse of my power. This was just like a miscommunication, misconnect. But it doesn't seem to have mattered. And so I am doing my best to use this whole thing as my spiritual practice of offering forgiveness, asking for forgiveness, taking full responsibility for everything that I have done that's been unskillful, and, you know, and just like watching a lot of what I've built crumble around me and saying like, okay, everything is practice. Everything is an opportunity for letting go, for telling the truth, for taking responsibility, and for meeting it with as much compassion and mercy and forgiveness as I can.
In a strange sense, and this is not to minimize what you're going through, but this is what you've been training for.
Absolutely.
In a sense, being wrongfully accused is a big deal. You know, the reverberations, even if someone said, "Oh no, he didn't do it, I lied," it's just a stigma once you say it, and that's, you know, just to have to deal with that. You know, when you believe in the Me Too movement and you've done all of these things and built all of these communities. Of a few of the takeaways that I saw, you know, I'm sure you don't want to do this interview and then we're just going to take your side. It's not about that, but I did notice you say that you take responsibility for what you weren't skillful about, which I think is,
absolutely,
you know, the appropriate thing. That's what you can do. And just to say, I didn't do anything, but maybe I'm missing something, let me know that. And also that none of these girls were your students. And I think that was missed. I certainly didn't know that until like very recently. and I think that's
I don't think anybody seems to care.
They talk about power
you
dynamic,
would imagine that they would,
and like you're a known teacher, so they're looking at that and that power dynamic. But I'm sure you don't walk around when you meet a female and think I have power over you. So there's just, I think it not being a student thing was something that was missed.
Yes.
Yeah, not to take away, once again, like I fully support the Me Too movement too. So it's, I just like things to be accurate, like anything, whether someone's wrongfully convicted in prison somewhere, like you just want the people that had those experiences to definitely get that light that they deserve. And that's it. So, thank you for going into that.
Yeah, man, happy to. And it's all unfolding. Maybe I don't know about the way it's supposed to be, but again, I just take it all as my practice and my recovery and my opportunity to really where the rubber hits the road and where we've trained for is like, okay, this fucking train wreck of an experience and huge betrayals, what I perceive as betrayals by some of my closest friends who and kind of being like, okay, like I'm gonna go, one of the things I'm gonna do this year is I'm gonna make contact with every single person and say, like, please forgive me for anything that I did that caused you harm. And I appreciate our friendship when we had it, and never talk to me again. And you're completely dead to me, but I want you to be dead to me with like closure, and you know what I mean? Like I want to like not have anything left unsaid.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, think of like, the reactive world that regardless of the way you personally practice, there's so much reaction, right? I mean, just in our social media, it's like a post and then like people telling you how you write the post wrong. Not just you, just in general.
Oh, for sure.
And everybody's a judge. And the thing is that living in that, trying to practice in that, and then with the extra stuff that you were dealing with, there's probably got to be a few people you got to be like, okay, we're done.
Yeah, there's a bunch of people that I feel like, the bridge is burned 100%, but I'm still going to, ask for forgiveness, just to be sure, and offer appreciation to, just to kind of like say, hey, these were some of my closest friends, and I really appreciate all of the time that we had a good relationship. Like that's done forever now. Yeah. But it doesn't take away that I appreciate all of those years of like happy connection that we had. So expressing the appreciation, offering and asking for the forgiveness, and just moving on.
Yeah. Lesson in impermanence, if I've ever heard one. So,
yeah, man.
So now, I know you're doing a retreat tomorrow, I believe, or all day sitting. Is that?
Yeah, I'll do I've got a place here in Venice, and so, I teach here every week, and I'm starting to do day-longs and sort of rebuilding the community that kind of dissolved when Against the Stream closed, and rebuilding it over here at my new space in Venice.
So I know you're probably sort of living with a little bit of equanimity, like let's just see what happens, a little bit lay low, but is there anything sparking in your mind like, hey, I want to write another book, I'm thinking about doing something bigger than what you're doing right now? Or is
I don't know. I mean, I feel so committed to what I have been doing, and I feel like it's been the kind of right thing to do, the teaching and inspiring people to practice meditation, and just keep doing that mostly. I will work on a new book. I'd like to do this book on like kind of almost Dharma Punks 2.0. Okay. 25 years later. Yeah. What's it look like? And some personal reflections like, okay, my marriage ended, my father died, I got Me Too'd and my community completely dissolved. And how was that at 30 years sober? And some personal reflections on that process.
Yeah. So the name of the podcast is If I Ruled the World. So we ask all our guests, what that would look like. So today we're going to say, Noah Levine, if you ruled the world, what would that look like?
That's an interesting question. It's a big question. If I ruled the world, I don't know. I'd want kind of equality, and I'd want to make sure that everybody had food and shelter, and access to healthcare, and healthy communities, and just all the basics is where I would start for sure. Abolish oppressive factors like religion and corrupt governments and violence and all of that stuff. But that's a pretty big question. Force nonviolence upon the whole world.
Noah Levine's a communist.
Yes.
Or a hippie.
You will not fight, or I will fight you.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, I'll live in that world.
Yeah.
I'll take it.
Yeah, man.
As far as me, Noah, thank you for doing the show.
Noah, great to talk to you again. When you come to New York, let us know. We'll promote what you're doing, and if you do any retreats or any meditation teachings out this way, let us know. We'll promote for it.
Awesome.
Okay.
If I ruled the world, I love 'em, baby.